I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the first ever series production fully electric Lexus. Resplendent in khaki metal green behind me, this is the new Lexus UX 300e, the first ever fully electric Lexus globally, but also the first one to come to Australia as well. And the fact that it's sitting behind me here in Victoria is interesting in itself, because a few years ago, the boss of Lexus Australia told me that he wouldn't be bringing an EV to Australia unless the ownership experience could be made to have Lexus characteristics. So while the UX 300e, a small SUV, may start at 74 grand, more than you'll pay for an entry-level Tesla or Polestar, Lexus wants to win you over with how easy this vehicle is to own. We're talking 3 years, free ChargeFox charging, we're talking free installation of a wall box at home, 2 travel charging cables, a 5-year warranty on the car, a 10-year warranty on the battery, the list goes on. But in today's video, we're going to be interrogating not just the running costs, but also what this vehicle is like, firstly as your primary means of transport, and secondly as an EV in itself, because this thing has a real-world range of just over 300 kilometers. Is that enough? And how does it drive? By having a smaller battery, Lexus have managed to keep the UX 300e a bit lighter than some of its rivals. It actually squeaks under 1,800 kilos in terms of curb weight. All of that sounds good to me. In today's video, we'll do our usual thing. We'll break down the interior, the back seat and boot. We'll discuss the running costs and the inclusions with this car, and then we'll head out onto the road in the UX 300e to see how this thing really stacks up before I give you my verdict. But before we get started, hit subscribe down below and the notification bell. I think it's pretty obvious to say that the UX 300e does not ride on a dedicated electric platform. It shares its TNGA chassis with the UX 200 petrol and the UX 250h hybrid. There will be dedicated Lexus EVs on their own platform in future years, but this is a place to start, under the bonnet of this khaki metal UX 300e. Ooh, no gas struts, boo hiss. But what you find under here is this car's single electric motor. Front mounted, front wheel drive. It produces 150 kilowatts of power and 300 Newton meters of torque. That's good for a 0 to 100 run of 7.5 seconds, which definitely gives this car a bit of a turn of speed, as we'll find out when we take it out onto the road here on the Victorian Surf Coast. Plenty of good driving to be had. The main takeaway here is look how low the motor is. Firstly, this weighs half the weight of the 2-litre petrol that you can get in this car, so turn-in should be nice and crisp. And the positioning of the motor, as well as the battery underneath the floor of this car, actually drastically lowers the car's center of gravity. Now, it is just under 1,800 kilos in terms of curb weight, so for a little car, it's a little hefty. But there are plenty of EVs that are heavier than this one, so I have high hopes for the ride and handling. As I mentioned, this UX 300e Sports Luxury is $81,000, and that's not cheap for a small premium crossover. But where the UX 300e starts to break away from the pack at this level is in terms of standard inclusions, but also the quality of the vehicle. And that's before we get to the stuff that Lexus throw in if you buy one of these, like the home charger, like the 2 charging cables, like the 3 years of free ChargeFox fast charging. So I guess once you look at what's standard on this car, the prices do start to make a bit more sense. So in the luxury grade, which is the entry level of the electric UX, you're getting things like heated and cooled seats and a heated steering wheel and heated rear seats too. Those are things that, you might get heated seats standard on some of this car's rivals, but you're not getting cooled seats, and that has been a significant complaint of mine in recent reviews of the Tesla Model 3 and also the Polestar 2, which are 2 of this car's competitors, plus the Mercedes EQA. In a hot country like Australia, you want cooled seats to start with, but particularly if you have non-animal skin seats, and the luxury UX has Nulux, which is vinyl, and you really want that to be cooled. Here in the Sports Luxury, we do get real leather seats. They're even more breathable. This car has ochre, tan, sashiko stitching on the seats, which is meant to replicate like a judo uniform. It all looks pretty cool. We also have this washi trim up here on the dashboard, which is composed of recycled materials and looks and feels great, and has contrast stitching in the leather color too, plus a leather steering wheel. I've already mentioned that it's heated. But the rest of the interior is pretty much classic UX, and that's a good thing in my eyes. Firstly, the design is interesting. But more importantly than that, the quality is just beautiful. I think that's the word for it. This car is just screwed together with such care. Every shut line in this car, be it outside or inside, is just perfect, down to the level of specificity that you expect from a Toyota product. And I think that's part of what you're paying for with this car. You can let me know down below in the comments whether you think that's fair enough or not. I do like the fact a 13-speaker Mark Levinson stereo is standard on this car. You also get this screen up here, which is quite crisp and clear and has wired Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, but it's not a touchscreen. You can see this is now one of the last Lexuses to have the screen really far back, so you can't touch it, which is a bit of a shame. In front of the driver, we have a really kind of 80s idea of the future instrument pack. So we've got a digital circular display with a acceleration and regen meter. We've got this really futuristic UX300E kind of inscription, and then actually a mechanical charge gauge. That's like the only time I've ever seen that on an EV, and it kind of feels like a Back to the Future DeLorean moment, but I do actually kind of love it. In terms of practicality, good size cup holders, wireless phone charging, one of these cool dual opening center consoles here, and okay size door bins as well. Pretty much everything is soft. I've already mentioned the quality. And also the seats are just comfortable and supportive. 10-way electrically adjustable. Driving position is nice and low. The view out of this car is pretty good. So while it does look kind of funky and a bit quirky outside, everything's in its place. Everything has a place. The interior works well. Let's check out the rear seats. If this car has a foible, it's probably backseat space, which is just not ideal in how high up your feet are. And that means that your legs are also high and not supported by the seat base. Legroom itself is okay. Headroom is fine for me at 6 foot. You could get someone into the middle seat at a pinch if you really had to. It's actually just the relative height of the floor plan back here. Now, it's no worse than the Tesla Model 3 in that sense. If you click on my review of that car, you'll see that your legs float in the air as well. Something like a Mercedes EQA or a Polestar 2 are more comfortable for rear seat passengers. That being said, this is just a start for Lexus. Their first BEV is a UX. The UX is small. It's a car that's designed for couples, maybe couples and a dog. So these back seats are kind of occasional, and as you can see, I fit, it works. We do have a few special features back here. We've got one map pocket, just the one. We've got air vents. We have 2 more USB-C ports here in the back. We actually have heated outboard seats. That really goes to the fact that like blasting the heater in the middle of winter is really bad for range. It's actually better just to heat the surface of the seat. Now I have seen these heated seat controls before on a Toyota RAV4. Let's just leave that alone. And we do actually have hard plastic door skins back here, which don't scream $81,000 to me, but you do get some Lexus-like attention to detail, including the fact that we have nice plastic trim covers here, so we don't actually see the exterior color of the car. That's something that they don't have to do. You don't get on a mainstream car, and it just finishes off the interior nicely. We also have a flip-down armrest with 2 cup holders, and the windows themselves are actually decent. There's a decent view out. It's not like a Toyota CHR that feels a bit like a jailhouse cell. Here around the back of the Lexus UX, you get the same funky styling that we've seen for the last few years on this smallest Lexus crossover. Personally, I'm a fan. Design is subjective, and polarizing designs will have some people that love it and some that hate it. You can let me know what you think down below. In terms of telling one of these vehicles from the hybrid, it's actually fairly easy. Firstly, we've got 300e around the back, but each of the back doors says electric just to kind of drive it home. And then we don't have any tailpipes, of course. Plus the 17-inch wheels on the luxury have a unique design. Anyway, we get a powered tailgate. That opens up to reveal 414 litres of space. This being Victoria, I of course have my umbrella right here. But we have a charging cable box here in the boot, and underneath the boot floor, you will find more space for charging cables and a tire inflation kit, because this vehicle doesn't have a spare wheel. I mean, it is kind of an urban, suburban sort of EV. Even a space saver would have been better than nothing, but that's how it is. Then we have controls here to either close the boot or close it and lock it. Just one single beep and then that closes down gently, I think we would say. And with that in mind, just before we take the UX onto the road, let's discuss the running costs of this EV. So what's it going to cost you to run a Lexus UX 300e? Well, the main saving is going to be in fuel costs, because particularly if you charge at home on off-peak charging, or if you have household solar, these things can be very, very inexpensive to recharge. Even public charging is around half the price of filling up this vehicle with petrol, so that's definitely a win. Let's talk about that first. So this car has a 50 kilowatt hour usable battery. The WLTP range is 305 kilometers. And in my very mixed test today that included a spirited hill climb and coming the way back down with a lot of regeneration, ended up giving a result of 17 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers in terms of consumption, and that implies a range of 294 kilometers to exhaustion, so 6% off the WLTP claim. That's pretty good in my books. Charging at a price of, say, 25 cents per kilowatt hour at home is going to cost you around 12 bucks to fill this thing up from empty to full. On warranty basis, yesterday Lexus announced that they're implementing a 5-year unlimited kilometer warranty on vehicles in Australia, backdated to all cars purchased in 2021. The policy officially comes into effect January 1st, 2022, but it is going to cover this UX 300e. And there's a new high voltage battery warranty of 10 years, 160,000 Ks, where the brand warrants that it won't degrade to less than 70% of its original capacity. In terms of servicing, you have to service this car every 12 months and 15,000 Ks, which is a little unusual for an EV. And each of the first 5 visits is going to cost you 295 bucks for a 5-year price of $1,475. And lastly, insurance. In the last 12 months, the median budget direct customer spent $1,278 to comprehensively insure a new Lexus UX. Everybody's situation varies, and your premium will vary based on things insurers take into account, like where you live, how you garage the car, and your driving history. So, what is the Lexus UX 300e like to drive? Well, it's interesting because while the UX has had combustion variants and a hybrid variant for several years now in this first generation form, the all-electric version of the UX feels remarkably different to drive in virtually every way. Perhaps that shouldn't really be a surprise. A fairly powerful electric motor, fairly large battery, they tend to change the dynamics of a vehicle compared to the sort of power, torque, and weight balance that you get in a petrol or petrol electric vehicle. This car has a single electric motor. It produces good outputs, 150 kilowatts of power and 300 Newton meters of torque. So that's really enough to make this vehicle easily the performance option within the UX lineup, as well as just a zero tailpipe emission vehicle. There is a UX 200, which is a 2-litre petrol, and there's a UX 250H, which is a 2-litre petrol with an electric motor for hybrid assistance, but neither of those vehicles really come close to the UX 300e in terms of sprightliness, and there's a full second difference between the electric and the hybrid on the 0 to 100 kilometer per hour sprint. So it actually feels handily quick, this car. Certainly not kind of snap your neck quick like some EVs, including the similarly priced Tesla Model 3 long range. That definitely feels more rapid than this car, but at no point during my drive today down here on Victoria's picturesque surf coast did I feel like I needed especially more power. The characteristics of the motor, in that it's incredibly refined, far smoother than either the petrol or the petrol electric version of the UX in terms of how power is delivered. Those things are all good, and I think that an electric Lexus makes a huge amount of sense, because one of the things that this brand does so well is refinement, luxury, quietness, and the inherent silence and smoothness of electric propulsion totally makes sense for this brand. And you can picture years into the future, a fully electric Lexus LS will elevate this brand to just absolutely unprecedented highs in terms of luxury and refinement. One thing that might not appeal if you've, say, come out of a Tesla and you're looking for a car with impeccable interior quality like this Lexus UX, is the regenerative braking might not be aggressive enough for your tastes. Right now I'm driving the car in B mode in the single speed transmission, and 4 down arrows of regeneration, which is the most aggressive that it gets. And when you lift off, there's sort of half a second of no result, and then it starts to just decelerate gently, but it's not hugely aggressive. It's nowhere near as aggressive as sort of the pronounced regeneration that you get on a Tesla Model 3, or even on something like a Nissan Leaf with the e-pedal. Definitely more aggressive. That being said, I think it's a guarantee that a lot of people that buy the UX 300e will be coming out of another Lexus, be it a petrol car or a hybrid. And so the slightly gentler, less head-snapping regen settings in this car, or even just the drive gear where there's no really detectable regen at all, is going to appeal to people. Hopefully that's a rundown of how it drives in terms of the electric powertrain. The next factor to consider is the ride and handling of the UX 300e, which is pretty different to the petrol or the hybrid version. There are naturally similarities, particularly in steering feel. That's one area where Lexus has a stated goal to target a really consistent steering feel across the entire range, something they call the Lexus driving signature. It's meant to just give you a really intuitive output from what you dial into the wheel. So the steering feel is quite similar to the standard car. I think it might be a touch lighter in its normal mode, but dialing up sport mode up here on the side of the instrument binnacle actually gives quite nice heft to the steering without feeling artificially heavy or ridiculous. It's just kind of the right weight. So while I don't normally select sport steering in cars because usually it feels too artificial for me, in the UX 300e it feels about right. And because this car doesn't have adaptive suspension, it just has a fixed rate suspension, selecting sport actually just gives the steering a bit more heft and makes the motor a little bit more responsive, and actually adds a touch more regenerative braking too. So sport mode is kind of like what I've been just picking by default when taking off in this car, jumping back into it. Now, huge difference in the way the UX handles, because where the weight is and what kind of weight it is totally different to the standard car. In the combustion and hybrid UX, they've got quite a bit of heft over the front axle in terms of their petrol engine, and then the optional hybrid system too. The hybrid has a very small battery, not really enough to make a huge impact in terms of weight, whereas here in the UX 300e, we have a very light motor over the front axle, half the weight of the petrol engine from the UX 200. And then between the axles, we have about a 54 kilowatt hour battery, 50 kilowatt hour usable, and that is heavy, definitely heavy enough to notice. Now, to Lexus's credit, I don't think the UX has an overly large battery for a car which is, basically pitched at sort of suburban use, but with the capability to do country road trips here and there, with the sort of 300k range. I think a 50 kilowatt hour usable battery is, a sensible size, because it means this car isn't clod hopping along, slamming into potholes because it's so ridiculously heavy. But that being said, you can certainly tell that there's mass between the axles. There's a little bit more inertia when this car is cornering than the petrol or the hybrid. But that being said, it turns in really crisply, largely because there's much less weight over the front axle. So if you get it turned in and you get it loaded up a little bit patiently on the outside tires, you can actually, maintain a really good pace on a nice country road like this one. You just can't sort of wantonly toss it about as much as you can the petrol and the hybrid UX, which are actually a total laugh to drive and have awesome cornering dynamics. The electric turns in really crisply, and it's probably a little bit more sophisticated in terms of it feels like a slightly bigger, heavier car than the standard or petrol and hybrid versions of the UX. But once you get used to where that mass is and how it kind of is a little inert as you start loading it up in the corner, you get used to that very quickly and you just drive it a slightly different way. However, there's absolutely one ace up the sleeve of the UX 300e in terms of handling, and that is that if you put the regen in its most aggressive setting, so B mode, and then pull the down paddle a few times, you actually have this left foot braking effect in the corners, where if you're able to just carefully balance the throttle pedal, allowing a little bit of regen braking to come in, it effectively is giving you the same result as a left foot braking technique in a combustion car. So you can really nip your line in, get the car pointed into the corner extremely well, and then just fire out on 300 Newton meters of instant torque. And all of that actually makes the UX 300e quite sophisticated and quite interesting to drive quickly on a country road. Now, the ride quality is, I think, not quite as compliant as the petrol and the hybrid version of the UX, but it's not starting from a tremendously high bass. Those cars do have a little bit of road feel to them already, but with the additional mass of the UX 300e, if you hit a nasty expansion joint or something, you do feel it in this car. But what's done well is actually the damping of sort of secondary bumps and undulating country roads. They are damped beautifully. It's just there's only so much you can do when you have a relatively small and short wheelbase car with a fair bit of weight between those axles when you strike a pothole, strike an expansion joint. It's by no means bad. It's just, you know, if you see a bump and you're at low speed, you're going to feel it in this car a little bit more than in the petrol or the hybrid. But out here where we're loping along, it actually has a really relaxing gait to it, this car. And so far I've enjoyed driving it. Definitely a shout out to the refinement. Plenty of sound insulation in this car. I'm on pretty horrible coarse chip right now, and as you can probably hear, it's nice and quiet in the cabin. Much better sound insulation than most other cars in this class, and noticeably quieter than the Mercedes EQA, which is also a relevant comparison for the ride. Even though I've explained there's a little bit more feel to the ride and a slight amount of extra chop at urban speeds to the 300e compared to the UX 200 or 250h, it's way more comfortable than the Mercedes EQA that I tested recently. Now, the EQA I drove was on 20s, the UX 300e tops out at 18s intelligently by Lexus, because this thing doesn't need more than 18s to support the aesthetic, and it means you've still got decent sidewall to do everything it can to help soak up the bumps and give the suspension a hand. So, you know, all in all, it feels like it's been a pretty well thought out car. There are some obvious weak points in terms of the CHAdeMO port. Some people will want extra range. The efficiency isn't best in class, although it isn't bad, and I've just had a long blast uphill, so it's reading 23 kilowatt hours per 100 Ks, oops. But before that, it was reading 16.2, so there you go. Last word on the safety features, so we've got the Lexus safety suite here. We have AEB, we've got lane keep assist, we have reversing AEB as well, adaptive cruise control, blind spot monitoring, and it all feels pretty well sorted, pretty well tuned. The lane keep assist, I think, could probably be a little bit more aggressive at tacking to the center of the lane, but it's not far off. And yeah, all in all, it feels like a car that does work with you as a driver. So those are my first impressions of the new Lexus UX 300e, the first Lexus to hit the market with a fully electric powertrain. Some of the things I like about this car are the quality and the refinement. It feels well built, it's extremely quiet inside. I like the standard inclusions. Things like Mark Levinson and cooled seats are not things that we generally see at this end of the market. It feels generously specified. And the last thing I really like is the ride and handling. It is fun to drive and it feels settled. It rides better than most of its rivals too. In the negatives column, it is expensive at the entry level. It's obviously balanced out in some way by specification, but there's no avoiding that this thing starts at 74 grand. It is also quite compact. If you want an EV with usable rear seats that is a Lexus product, you're going to be waiting until the NX plug-in hybrid or something else fully electrified in future. And lastly, unlike the hybrid version of this car, there's no dual motor all-wheel drive UX 300e, something that would probably make it even quicker and quite usable in slippery conditions too. That being said, I think on the whole, this is a really good entrant for Lexus in the electric segment. It makes ownership easy. You have Encore Platinum if you need to borrow a combustion Lexus for an easier, longer road trip. You have a longer warranty now that Lexus has finally moved to 5 years. So there are a number of boxes this car does tick. Keen to hear your view. Let me know down below in the comments. While you're there, make sure to hit the notification bell and the subscribe button. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.